Hello, students. This is Professor Gore, and this is part one of the Exploration and Colonization PowerPoint. And so, what we're going to be talking about here is kind of like some history before the Europeans kind of came to the Western Hemisphere, excuse me, and then also kind of some impact of where the Europeans are exploring and its impact on the Native American societies that are living in the Western Hemisphere. And so, we're to kind of set a context to what's happening for Native Americans that are living in both the northern and southern hemisphere of what becomes the United States, Canada, Mexico, and then on the rest of South America. So a lot of Mesoamerica and so forth we do cover in world history, what is happening in these societies and so forth. So let's look at kind of what's happening for Native Americans in relation with what becomes eventually U.S. history. So basically, when the first Europeans arrived, we're talking about the Spanish. Obviously, the Vikings came before, but we don't really have any kind of hard information. But this is all estimated. There was about 40 million people living in present-day Mexico and Guatemala. Okay, so that is where the highest concentration of populations were living, just because the climate can support large amount of food surplus that can feed that large of a population. Okay, and also in this number, that's including the western coast of South America, which is present-day Peru, Ecuador, a little bit into Bolivia, and so forth. While some Native Americans lived in hunter-gatherer agricultural communities, most lived in societies ruled by warrior kings and priests. Okay, much like what you would see when we talk about in World History 1, how a lot of societies are built to kind of around the strong man and so forth. So some of you should know this from previous education in your lives, is that Native Americans came from Asia. Okay, and so because the world had experienced an ice age, the most common theory, and it's generally accepted, is that because of the ice caps, the sea levels had lowered, and there was kind of a land bridge. They called Beringia, that connected Russia to present-day Alaska. And so, in fact, in the winter, you can actually take a snowmobile when it freezes all the way to Russia from Alaska if you want. I don't know why you would do that, because it'd be extremely cold, but you could. But they took this land route, and as Native Americans most likely followed herds of animals. They traveled through Alaska, and then down the east side of the Rocky Mountains, also down the west side of the Rocky Mountains. Now, as they went into Washington State, Oregon, down in Northern California, and so forth. In fact, as one of my professors in grad school taught me, that if you're looking at in the lower 48 states, part of the United States, probably the oldest highway, not actually like paved road, but trail that humans traveled on, is right there on the front range of the Rocky Mountains. It goes right through Denver, okay, and like Boulder and Fort Collins and all that kind of stuff, all that part of Colorado, down through up into Wyoming and Montana and so forth, because it was a lot easier to travel right there in front of the front range of the Rocky Mountains on the east side of the Rockies than it was to obviously travel over the mountains, which would be extremely difficult. So Native Americans would eventually spread out into the rest of what becomes the United States, the lower 48 states. Larger populations are able to be supported in this region right here in the eastern part of the United States. And the real reason for that is climate. You have more rainfall, also navigable rivers and so forth, more fertile soil, a lot of trees in that area. And so plenty of places to build lodging with that timber, but also to be able to support larger populations. But as more and more humans start traveling down into what's called Mesoamerica, this part right here, this part of the Western Hemisphere can support much larger populations because of the climate. It's warmer there. So therefore you have, in fact, I've been to Mexico and Guatemala, and I can attest to the heat, but you can grow stuff for much longer seasons. And so as we'll see, that maize, or what we now know as corn, is going to be able to feed large scale populations. Now, I know it's a starch, I know it's terrible for your teeth and so forth, and it's not the most nutritious thing you could be eating, but you can survive off of corn, and because they're able to grow it in such large surpluses, it could support such large populations. And eventually, Native Americans are going to travel down into South America, and settling into a very fertile part of the western part of South America because of its rainfall. I've been to Peru a few times, and I can attest to the rainfall and the lush greenness and so forth. And even though you're in the mountains, there is a thick layer of topsoil on top of the Andes Mountains that allows you to farm what they call terrace farming. And because of rainfall, you can produce large surplus crops and therefore support large populations. And so that's where the Mesoamerica along the present day Peru, Ecuador area are able to support that 40 million population for people that were living in those regions by the time the Europeans came. Obviously, all that's estimated. This is done through the work of archaeology and so forth. Okay, so the Bering Strait, just want to recap, is where where Native Americans traveled. Sometimes you'll see them in more modern or more updated textbooks. The most recent ones are starting to refer to them as Amerindians. Same thing, Native Americans, Amerindians, whichever term you want to use. But anyway, that's why you see the name changing a little bit, is that they're just using an updated term. And so they're following the herds and so forth. Okay. Now, as time goes along, they're able to start, instead of having just hunter-gatherer societies, they're able to have sedentary lifestyles. You can look at this topographical map here. You can see that this is very dry. This is the driest part of the Great Plains. You can see the mountains, obviously. And then you can see the green areas. This is areas that would support farming. Now, up here is a little bit deceiving because it's so cold. You're not going to be able to really farm much up there. Okay. So also there's theories that Native Americans sailed. The reason why they think that is because of the Polynesian migrations that take place from what we call Oceania and world history. Okay. So those that take either world history 1 or 2, we'll talk about Oceania and the Polynesian migrations. Hawaii right here is an example of where the Polynesian migrations ended up coming. And there's a lot of islands and so forth in the Pacific that we cover, particularly when we talk about World War II. Because a lot of important battles that take place there. But it's theorized that they came across the ocean. But the most common theory is that they came across the Bering Strait. Okay. Now, this is not an exhaustive list of the Native Americans that were living in North America at the time of the Europeans' arrival. Okay. So don't think that this is an exhaustive list that includes every Native American tribe. And language and so forth, but it covers a good amount of them. Okay, and so in fact, when I lived in Texas, I taught just south of a neighborhood in Richardson Richardson, Texas, called the Reservation. My wife and I actually looked at 2 different houses there and actually put an offer on one of them. But each of the street names is named after Native American tribes. So you had Arapaho, which was on the outside of the neighborhood, and you had Cherokee Street and among other streets and so forth. So you can see, actually there was a Choctaw Street as well, but you can see where these Native American people groups are going to be generally living and so forth. And so now the Sioux is a little bit deceiving. They were actually over here in Minnesota. They didn't move out to the Great Plains until later when other groups pushed them out. Okay, so how did the early Native Americans provide for themselves? Well, first, they hunted and gathered food. So that means they hunted big game. North America is blessed with a lot of wildlife, and there was lots of wildlife to hunt. You had deer, you had elk, other mammals that you can hunt, squirrels, beaver, marmots, bison, which is kind of the most famous animal of North America, I would say. You can even hunt bear and so forth. Also, you can gather berries and other food crops that you can eat. Okay, so what led to large-scale sedentary means staying in one place civilizations forming? Okay, it is maize. Highlight that, star it, underline it, circle it, whatever you need to do, but you've got to understand the importance of maize or corn. You need to understand that you can use either names, but we typically refer to it as maize because that's what the Native Americans refer to it as. And maize supports large-scale populations. And that's what allows a lot of those civilizations in the Western Hemisphere to stay in one place. Okay, So I'm going to repeat this. It is maize is primarily the main crop that allows those civilizations to stay in one place. Now, is it the only one? No. But is it the largest? Yes. Okay. So here's some other crops that allow them to stay in one place in a sedentary lifestyle. Beans, squash. My wife loves squash. I hate it. Tomatoes. My whole family loves tomatoes, although I love ketchup but not tomatoes so much. Potatoes. Okay, both general russet potatoes and sweet potatoes, and we'll see with the climate exchange. The Eastern Hemisphere has never grown potatoes ever until the Europeans bring it back to the Eastern Hemisphere, and it forever changes the world's population in the Eastern Hemisphere because, excuse me, potatoes provide more calories per acre than any other plant that is grown. Okay, at least at this time in history. And then manioc is or as we call cassava today, is another crop that can support populations. Okay. Now we're going to talk about the explorations of Columbus, and then eventually the conquest of the conquistadors from Spain and also Portugal. But before we get there, let's look at one of the most popular civilizations in this part of the world, and that's the Mayans. Okay, they're well known for the Mayan calendar. We cover them a lot more in depth in world history, particularly in World History 1 and so forth. But they lived along the Gulf of Mexico and the Yucatan Peninsula. This is where, like Cancun area, if you were vacation there, they were mostly farmers. They lived in large city-states. Okay, that's primarily where they lived. And they were very well known for their large cities. They were very warlike. And it's not really known for sure what led to their decline. They also built incredible kind of water systems for like using water pressure to provide to take some of the rain that comes in the Yucatan. It rains a lot there to be able to use that to harvest for water for their civilization. And they really do some extensive stuff. And really, how we kind of do modern sewers in terms of water pressure, the Mayans kind of developed a primitive version of that. Okay, they also developed the Mayan calendar, and but they went in decline about 800. I know I have AD because I've been teaching for about a decade since when I'm making this. Now they're starting to use the term CE, Common Era. So anytime you see AD or CE, it's the same thing. Okay, Anno Domini was commonly used throughout a lot of studying of history, and now we're using, instead of saying BC before Christ, we're using BCE before Common Era, and then CE for Common Era. Okay. Now the Aztecs, they were a very warlike civilization, and but don't forget to mention the Mayans primarily grew corn, a lot of other crops. I was just talking about beans, squash, and others. And there's various theories. Warfare, attacks by a rival group. They had potentially tuberculosis that could have broke out. Yes, Native Americans did have disease, just not smallpox and influenza and typhoid fever and some of the big civilization killers. But they did have tuberculosis, which is a bacterial infection of the lungs. And then the Aztecs, sometimes in more recent world history textbooks, we're seeing the term Mexica, because the Mexica were the dominant group within the Aztec civilization that subdued the other people groups around them. Okay, and so that's where we get the term Mexico from, is the Mexica. And so they developed their capital city around Teotihuacan. It's present-day Mexico City, about 200,000 inhabitants. It was the largest city in the Western Hemisphere at the time of the Europeans' arrival. It was massive for that day and age. Very large civilization, very aggressive. They did have a written language and elaborate irrigation systems, and so forth. They were not very popular among the people they subjugated because they would attack surrounding people groups and then enslave them or force them to provide tribute. And tribute would be taxes and also human captives that they would sacrifice for their animistic religion. And so with their animistic religion and so forth, they thought that in order to have good birth rates and fertile harvest, that you needed to practice human sacrifice and let blood flow into the earth, and it would appease the Mother Earth and so forth, and that would provide good birth rates and also good harvests and so forth. But it was very brutal civilization without question. The Mayans did it as well. They had a huge trade network that went all the way up to northern Mexico. It probably connected with Native American civilizations up in the present day United States. They also had a trade network that went down through the Yucatan Peninsula into present day South America as well by trading with other people groups. Now, one thing to take note of is that no people group in the Western Hemisphere really had large pack animals. Now, in Peru, they had alpacas and llamas, but they did not have horses, oxen, donkeys, mules, those types of animals carry much heavier weights. Llamas and alpacas can only carry so much. Some Native American tribes in North America had domesticated dogs, but they can only carry so much on a sled and so forth. And so a lot of it was carried on their backs. So they don't have the extensive luxury good trade network that the Eastern Hemisphere has that we talk about a lot in world history. Okay. Now, I'm going to actually pause there. We're going to come back to Native Americans north of Mesoamerica in part 2 of this lecture.